What kind of faith makes a man bury himself alive? That's the question that haunted historians in 1987, when a group of restoration workers uncovered a sealed wooden chest beneath the floorboards of a small chapel outside Krakow, Poland. Inside, they found a rusted lantern, a set of rosary beads, and a leather-bound journal wrapped carefully in linen. The first page bore a date, April 3, 1894, and the signature of Father Wiktor Kulesza, a parish priest long believed to have vanished during a storm that spring. At first, the find seemed mundane, another relic from a century of Catholic devotion. But as the pages were examined, something in the ink unsettled even the most composed scholars. The writing began calm, reflective, like any other priest's confession, until it shifted. Father Kulesza's final entries documented something almost unimaginable, a sacred experiment in death. In his own hand, he wrote, "I am not dying, only testing the silence that comes after prayer." The journal described preparations for a ritual of isolation and burial, not symbolic, but literal. Kulesza detailed how he constructed a coffin, with air vents fitted with a small lamp, a crucifix, and parchment to record each breath until the Lord calls it back. But when church records were cross-referenced, one disturbing fact emerged. There was no record of his burial. The coffin found later beneath the chapel was empty. No remains, no trace of the man. Over the next century, whispers spread among clergy and historians alike that Kulesza's final act wasn't suicide or madness, but an unorthodox spiritual experiment, an attempt to witness death consciously, to cross the threshold between body and soul and return with proof of eternity. As one historian later wrote, if Father Kulesza truly buried himself alive and wrote as he suffocated, it may be the most disturbing act of faith ever recorded. And so begins the investigation, not into a legend, but into a document that blurs the line between devotion, delirium, and the human hunger to meet God face to face. To understand Father Wiktor Kulesza's story, we have to return to a world both devout and desperate, Eastern Europe in the late 19th century, a time when faith was not simply belief, but survival. The church dominated not only the soul, but the rhythm of every life, every season, every death. Poland, still partitioned by empires, found its only unity in religion, a people clinging to God through war, poverty, and plague. It was a century of extremes, of saints and zealots, mystics and martyrs. The line between holiness and obsession blurred easily. In remote parishes, stories circulated of priests who fasted to the point of delirium, who scourged themselves in imitation of Christ, or locked themselves away in stone cells to hear the voice of God more clearly. They were admired, pitied, and feared, men who believed that suffering was the purest form of prayer. In the tiny Polish village of Nowa Pusta, population barely 300, stood one such man, Father Wiktor Kulesza. Parishioners remembered him as quiet, meticulous, and strangely distant, a man who loved silence as others loved music. He was known to walk the fields before dawn, whispering psalms to the empty air. Some villagers swore he never slept. Others said they saw him standing before the altar for hours, unmoving, as if waiting for something, or someone to answer. Kulesza had served the same chapel for nearly 20 years. His sermons grew increasingly abstract, less about salvation, more about purification, solitude, and the death of self. Parish records from the 1890s describe him as faithful, though fatigued by contemplation. Then, in March 1894, he stopped preaching altogether. Within a month, he disappeared. The church simply listed him as missing. Decades passed. The chapel fell into disrepair. His name faded into rumor, a cautionary ghost story whispered among seminarians. Until 1978, when restoration workers repairing the cracked stone floor uncovered a sealed wooden box beneath the altar. Inside lay a decayed rosary, a soil-stained priest's vestment, and a small leather-bound book sealed with wax. The first page bore a single phrase, "The Ritual of Descent." Those words reignited an old mystery. Was this the personal testament of a man driven mad by isolation, or a record of a deliberate experiment in divine proximity? Over the next 4 decades, Historians, theologians, and forensic experts would attempt to separate faith from fanaticism, miracle from madness, to understand what could drive a priest to bury himself alive and write about it as he went under. When the diary was first examined in 1978, the researchers didn't realize what they were holding. At a glance, it was just a brittle, decaying book, its cover warped by decades of moisture, the leather flaking into dust. But once opened, the pages revealed handwriting so meticulous, so controlled, that one archivist described it as calligraphy written on the edge of madness. The ink had bled through in places, the result of damp air and age, yet the words remained strangely legible, a sign that the ink was high in iron gall, the kind favored by clerics for its permanence. The paper was Polish linen stock, consistent with 19th century parish use. Nothing about it suggested forgery, and yet the content did. The first entries were pastoral, confessional. Father Kulesza wrote of feeling estranged from God's voice and of nights when prayer no longer brought comfort. But soon the tone shifted. He began recording visions, voices whispering through the soil beneath the chapel, calling him to return to the earth. He described it as a divine summons, not to die, but to surrender his body to the silence that precedes resurrection. One of the most analyzed lines in the diary reads, "To know resurrection, one must share in the stillness before it." To modern theologians, the phrasing is both poetic and terrifying. It echoes early ascetic traditions, monks who would lie inside open coffins to meditate on death, or sleep inside crypts to overcome fear. But nowhere in Christian history had such rituals been performed literally to completion. Kulesza's language suggested something far more extreme, a man planning not to simulate death, but to meet it consciously, with pen in hand. Experts in forensic theology studied the diary for decades. The ink's mineral content matched samples from the chapel's original sacristy, confirming authenticity. The paper's fibers dated accurately to the 1890s. Every sign pointed to one thing: the diary was real. But authenticity didn't explain intent. Psychologists brought in to interpret the text found disturbing signs of mental decline, intrusive guilt, obsessive repentance, and auditory hallucinations. They speculated that religious psychosis, likely triggered by years of isolation, may have led him to mistake his inner voice for the divine. One clinical historian remarked, "He wasn't seeking death, he was seeking proof of immortality." Church archives added another layer. Attendance at Kulesza's parish had dropped sharply in late 1893. Several parishioners complained of unholy vigils, masses held at midnight, where the priest reportedly chanted psalms facing the floor instead of the cross. In February 1894, the last known letter written by him to the local diocese was found. "The time has come for me to be still beneath his hand." Then he vanished. Was the diary a genuine final testimony written by a priest slowly descending into self-imposed martyrdom, or a later fabrication meant to elevate him to mythic status? A century later, scholars still debate that question. But one detail silences most doubts. In the final pages, written with unsteady ink and tremors visible in the lines, Father Kulesza describes the construction of his coffin in chilling precision. Measurements, air holes, waxed cloth, a lantern, and room enough to write. His last entry ends mid-sentence. "The soil accepts me now, I feel it pressing," the page stops there. For years, the diary was treated as a disturbing curiosity, until researchers began comparing its descriptions with the actual structure of the chapel where it was found. Beneath the wooden floorboards lay a stone crypt, sealed long before modern restoration. The architectural records showed no mention of it in the original blueprints. Yet, when investigators carefully entered the space, they found the remains of a narrow pit, roughly the dimensions of a coffin, carved directly into the earth beneath the altar. The resemblance to Kulesza's own written descriptions was undeniable. In the diary, he spoke of a chamber of stillness below the house of God, a place closer to the dust from which Adam was formed. The measurements in his notes, the width, depth, and curvature of the walls matched the crypt precisely. It was here, the experts concluded, that the priest may have carried out his self-burial ritual. What baffled engineers and historians alike was the mechanical detail described in his journal. Kulesza was no inventor, yet his notes revealed an understanding of physics far beyond that of a simple parish priest. He wrote about building a self-lowering coffin, a wooden enclosure attached to a pulley system fixed to the crypt's ceiling. Using counterweights and a lever, he could gradually lower himself into the earth and seal the lid from within. Primitive, yes, but mechanically possible. Fragments of iron fittings and pulleys found during excavation lent unsettling weight to his account. Even the rusted remnants of a breathing pipe, a narrow hollow tube extending toward the surface, were discovered, just as the diary described. The pipe's interior showed traces of wax residue, likely from a candle or oil lamp placed inside to provide light. According to the text, Kulesza planned every stage meticulously. He fasted for 40 days, performing liturgies of penance alone, and wrote of washing himself in blessed soil as purification. The final phase he called the descent. He described lying within the coffin, the oil lamp flickering beside him, the air growing heavier. He wrote prayers not of fear but of submission. "If I am worthy, let him take my breath as offering." Scholars continue to argue about whether this act was meant as temporary confinement or as a deliberate passage to death. Some believe Kulesza saw it as a form of ultimate asceticism, a symbolic entombment meant to last mere hours, perhaps a night, before his resurrection through faith. Others suggest he intended never to return. A chilling entry dated December 3, 1894, leaves little ambiguity. The earth presses closer now. The air is thin. I am still speaking to God, though he has stopped answering. It was his last legible sentence. The ink beneath it trails downward, faint and broken, as if his hand trembled or the lamplight failed. When restoration workers later uncovered the crypt, they expected to find remains. But what they found instead raised even more questions. The coffin was there, warped, splintered, its lid clawed from within. Under magnification, forensic analysts identified human nail markings, desperate scratches etched into the wood. Yet no body was present, only traces of decayed cloth fibers and fragments of bone dust, too little for full identification. This absence ignited a century of speculation. Had the priest been exhumed later, his death quietly covered up by parish officials, terrified of scandal? Archival letters from the diocese show a sudden order in early 1895 to seal the chapel grounds from all unauthorized access. No mention of a body, no record of burial rites. Some researchers believe the church intervened, removing what was left of Kulesza, to prevent his act from being mistaken for sanctity or madness. Others argue a more haunting possibility, that the diary, though authentic, never reached its end. Perhaps he escaped, dug his way out in delirium, or was rescued before death and hidden away by those loyal to him. But no evidence supports this. No later sightings, no additional writings. What remains certain is that something profound occurred beneath that chapel. The soil told its story in silence, compressed layers showing disturbance consistent with burial, then later reopening. The wooden beams above bore faint scorch marks, possibly from the priest's oil lamp as air thinned and heat built within. The forensic reconstruction paints an image both tragic and obsessive, a man of deep conviction, lowering himself into a tomb of his own making, believing that through darkness he would glimpse divinity. And yet, the final paradox remains: the coffin was sealed, the earth undisturbed, but the man himself gone. No remains, no relic, no closure. Only a diary that ends with a fading line, and a chapel whose foundations still seem to whisper the same question. What kind of faith compels a man to bury himself alive? And right until the very last breath? When Father Wiktor Kulesza vanished from Nowa Pusta in the winter of 1894, the event was treated not as tragedy, but as an inconvenience. Within days, his parish was quietly reassigned to a younger clergyman from Krakow. No official statement was issued. The congregation was told that Father Kulesza had been called away to serve elsewhere. But in a village where everyone knew everyone, silence spoke louder than any sermon. His home remained locked, his modest belongings undisturbed. The chapel bell no longer rang for dawn mass. The priest had disappeared, and with him, the uneasy calm that once blanketed the valley. Months later, the Diocese of Krakow began receiving letters. anonymous, written in trembling script, describing whispers of a priest who buried himself alive to hear the voice of God. At first, these were dismissed as rural superstition, but as the story spread across neighboring parishes, the diocese took notice. Archival letters uncovered a century later reveal the Church's true response: an orchestrated silence. One memo dated February 1895 reads, "Father Kulesza's name shall be withdrawn from clerical record. No correspondence or mass shall bear his mention." His existence, it seemed, was to be erased, not out of disdain, but out of fear. To the Church, faith must always lead toward God, never toward madness. And yet history is filled with those who blurred the boundary. The Stylites, who spent decades atop stone columns. The Flagellants, who whipped their flesh until it bled in the name of penance. The Anchorites, who sealed themselves in brick cells to live as the dead among the living. These acts were tolerated, even sanctified, so long as they ended in devotion, not despair. But Kulesza's self-burial crossed a forbidden line. He had sought not symbolic death, but physical obliteration. A Vatican report from 1901, unearthed by modern researchers, classified his writings as non-canonical and dangerous to faith. The same document ordered that the recovered portions of his diary, those copied before the original, disappeared, be held in restricted theological custody, in other words, hidden. Officially, Kulesza was never condemned, but unofficially his act was treated as spiritual contamination, a warning that faith, ungoverned by doctrine, could turn inward and devour itself. Among theologians, the case provokes uncomfortable debate. Was Kulesza a heretic or a saint who went too far? Dr. Helena Krupinska, a contemporary theologian specializing in mysticism, phrases it cautiously. The Church fears what it cannot categorize. To suffer for God is virtue. To seek God through death is vanity. But what if he believed there was no difference? In the decades that followed, oral legends replaced facts. Old villagers told their children about the priest who buried himself to speak with angels. Others swore that on winter nights, the chapel floor would emit faint knocking sounds, as if something below still stirred. When restoration began in 1978 and the diary was uncovered, these tales resurfaced, and with them, the Church's reluctance to acknowledge what had been found. Forensic historians attempted to access diocesan archives, only to encounter redacted documents and missing correspondences. The Vatican declined comment on whether Kulesza's writings had ever been reviewed by its congregation for the doctrine of the faith. One internal letter, however, hints at a reason for continued secrecy. The writings of Father K exhibit profound confusion between resurrection theology and physical reinterment. Their dissemination would encourage dangerous imitation. But imitation of what? To bury oneself alive in the hope of spiritual union? Or to abandon earthly sense in pursuit of divine proof? That question lies at the heart of every discussion about Kulesza. Modern scholars see in him a tragic embodiment of devotion turned inward, a man consumed not by evil, but by the unbearable silence of unanswered prayer. His final entries reveal a shift, subtle at first, then terrifyingly clear. The tone that once overflowed with devotion begins to tremble with doubt. The last legible lines, written in a cramped, uneven hand, read, "It is not God's silence I hear. It is something else. No theologian can agree on what he meant." Some interpret it as the onset of delirium, the oxygen deprivation of a dying man. Others, particularly those inclined toward mysticism, believe he may have felt the presence of something beyond comprehension, not divine, but abyssal. What unsettles historians most is that his act was not impulsive. Every element, the coffin, the breathing pipe, the final prayers, was meticulously planned, as though he sought to choreograph his passage between worlds. He did not flee from faith. He attempted to meet it face to face. In the years following his disappearance, the Church ensured that his name faded from records. Yet faith, once touched by such extremity, leaves traces in whispered stories, in unmarked graves, in the uneasy conscience of institutions that prefer silence to scandal. The section closes as one scholar summarizes what perhaps no one dares to say aloud. If Kulesza's faith led him to God, then we must ask what kind of God answers from beneath the earth. And if it did not, then perhaps we are still listening to the wrong silence. The story of Father Wiktor Kulesza is not merely about one man's madness or holiness. It is about the uneasy frontier between devotion and delusion, and the Church's enduring struggle to decide which is which. Nearly a century after, Father Wiktor Kulesza vanished from history. His name resurfaced not from the lips of priests or villagers, but from the quiet hum of academic machinery in a Warsaw archive. It was 1994, exactly 100 years after the priest's supposed self-burial, when historian Dr. Eliza Nowak, an expert in Eastern European ecclesiastical studies, stumbled across a brief archival note titled Non-Canonical Writings, Diocese of Krakow, Restricted Collection. Inside the brittle folder was a faded inventory list. Diary fragments of Father W. Kulesza, Parish of Nowa Pusta, recovered during chapel restoration, 1978. The moment Nowak read the name, she felt what she later described as a pulse through the paper, the sensation that something long buried had just shifted in the dark. Unlike most legends of religious extremism, this one had evidence, tangible, testable, and forgotten. Dr. Nowak tracked down the restoration workers who had unearthed the box beneath the chapel floor 16 years earlier. 2 of them were still alive, and their accounts matched precisely: a decayed leather-bound journal, a wooden rosary, a fragment of cloth still smelling faintly of oil and earth. The items had been handed to the diocesan authorities, then quietly transferred to storage. When Nowak finally obtained access, the diary lay before her, its pages fragile as autumn leaves, yet unmistakably real. The handwriting was uneven, but consistent, the ink iron gold typical of the 1890s, and the language, a mixture of formal Latin and archaic Polish, bore every sign of authenticity. To eliminate doubt, she invited a forensic document specialist, Professor Jerzy Krawczyk, to perform a full authentication using modern methods. Under ultraviolet and infrared light, the diary revealed secrets invisible to the naked eye. Beneath, the written lines, faint as ghostly echoes, were erased prayers and overwritten sentences, as if the priest had changed his mind mid-thought. Some phrases, barely legible, read like suppressed confessions. "I dig not for death but for proof," and "he said the soil would speak back." No known forger of the era could have replicated the ink layering or natural oxidation patterns that confirmed their age. Next came the question of the burial site itself. With permission from local authorities and the church, a small research team conducted ground-penetrating radar scans beneath the old chapel in Nowa Pusta. The readings showed what appeared to be anomalous cavities, symmetrical depressions beneath the stone crypt, consistent with a filled burial pit. Excavation began cautiously, centimeter by centimeter. On the 4th day, the radar signatures were confirmed, a hollow space, roughly the size of a coffin. When the soil was carefully removed, archaeologists discovered faint skeletal remains, partial disarticulated, and scattered through the compacted dirt. Initial analysis determined they belonged to an adult male, aged between 40 and 50. Father Kulesza was 46 when he disappeared, but it was not the discovery of bones that most disturbed the researchers. It was their position. The skeleton was found upright, as if sitting or struggling to rise. The upper limbs were flexed, hands clawing toward where the coffin lid would have been. Soil compression suggested post-burial movement, an agonizing possibility that the priest had indeed been alive when the soil closed over him. When word of the find leaked, the Polish press erupted. Within weeks, headlines screamed "The living burial priest of Nowa Pusta" and "The martyr of silence." Television crews descended upon the remote village, broadcasting images of the chapel and interviewing stunned locals who barely remembered the legend. Some residents spoke of hearing knocks beneath the chapel floor during winter masses, a superstition that suddenly felt far less metaphorical. For Dr. Nowak, the sudden media frenzy complicated what had begun as a sober academic inquiry. Her objective was never spectacle, but understanding. Still, she couldn't deny the eerie convergence of evidence. A diary describing a ritual burial, an underground cavity aligned precisely with his chapel, skeletal remains matching his age, and church archives confirming his disappearance. Yet skepticism emerged just as quickly. A faction of archaeologists argued that the bones might predate Kulesza by centuries, possibly a remnant from earlier burials beneath the chapel foundations, a common medieval practice. Others proposed that the entire diary could have been a later fabrication, created by 19th century mystics to inspire devotion or fear. Dr. Nowak countered with science. Radiocarbon testing of the bone fragments returned a date range between 1880 and 1910, perfectly consistent with Kulesza's lifetime. The soil analysis around the remains showed traces of oil residue and candle soot, matching the priest's description of an oil lamp for the final vigil. Even the rope fibers found near the cavity matched those used in 19th century Polish liturgical bindings. Still, not everyone was convinced. The church, once again, distanced itself from the findings, issuing a brief statement. The diocese acknowledges the historical investigation, but maintains that acts of self-burial are inconsistent with Catholic doctrine. No official comment will be made regarding Father Kulesza's life or death. For the media, silence was fuel. Documentaries emerged across Europe, some sober and investigative, others sensational and gothic. A 1996 film titled The Priest Beneath the Earth framed Kulesza as both saint and sinner, a man caught between salvation and insanity. Talk shows debated whether his act was a miracle or suicide. Skeptics accused Nowak of chasing fame. She responded quietly, saying only, "The soil does not lie. What lies is our fear of what it reveals." Over time, the frenzy faded, replaced by academic curiosity. The diary was preserved under climate control in Krakow's Historical Institute, and portions were digitized for scholarly study. Each translated line deepened the enigma rather than resolved it. In one of her final interviews before retirement, Dr. Nowak summarized the case with an unsettling calm. "We confirmed that he existed. We confirmed that he planned the burial. We even confirmed that a man his age died beneath that chapel. But what we will never confirm, what science cannot touch, is whether he found what he was seeking in that silence." Even today, the small chapel in Nowa Pusta remains open to the public. Beneath its floor, sealed under protective glass, lies the faint outline of the pit, the place where faith and fear became indistinguishable. Visitors kneel, some in reverence, others in morbid awe, whispering prayers not to the heavens above but to the quiet earth below, where a priest once sought to speak to God and perhaps heard something else answer. In the decades that followed the rediscovery, Father Wiktor Kulesza's name took on a life far beyond his own. What had once been whispered only in fragments, the priest who buried himself to hear God, became a story that rippled through Polish folklore, theology, and psychology alike. The chapel in Nowa Pusta, once forgotten and nearly swallowed by the countryside, transformed into a strange kind of shrine. Villagers began to visit quietly, leaving candles at the stone threshold or placing wildflowers near the sealed pit beneath the floor. Some knelt to pray, whispering for peace. Others simply stared into the faint glass outline marking the site of his descent. Children were told to step lightly there, for fear of waking the silence he entered. Among the older generation, two beliefs emerged. The first painted Kulesza as a secret saint, a man who reached spiritual transcendence through ultimate surrender, one who buried not his body, but his ego, achieving divine stillness beyond human comprehension. These villagers claimed that his act was not death but ascension, that his soul merged with the earth itself, guarding the chapel in silence. The second view was darker. To others, Kulesza was a cautionary figure, a priest consumed by his own obsession who mistook madness for faith. They said his isolation had driven him to hear voices not from heaven, but from within, and that his burial was no holy act, but a tragedy born from delusion. In this version, his silence was not divine. It was the silence of despair. The Catholic Church, ever wary of theological controversy, maintained distance. In 1997, the Krakow diocese released a brief and carefully worded statement. The Church recognizes Father Wiktor Kulesza as a man of his time, shaped by the fervor and struggles of 19th century devotion. His writings, while historically significant, remain outside accepted doctrine. We offer prayers for his soul, as for all who sought faith through suffering. No official condemnation, no canonization, only quiet acknowledgement. The Church closed the matter, but the people did not. Scholars, meanwhile, continued to debate his legacy. Theologians from Warsaw to Rome argued over the line between faith and self-destruction. Some framed his actions as a desperate attempt to imitate Christ's death and resurrection. Others, as a form of psychological martyrdom, where isolation, deprivation, and guilt culminated in spiritual collapse. In her final report, Dr. Eliza Nowak refused to label him saint or sinner. She wrote, "Whether he suffocated or transcended, Father Kulesza found the silence he sought and left us to interpret it." She concluded that his life was not a mystery to solve, but a mirror, reflecting what faith becomes when it turns inward too long. Today, the legend of Father Kulesza exists between fact and faith. His diary rests in a museum vault, the chapel remains standing, and his story continues to be told, half history, half haunting. For those who visit Nowa Pusta, the air inside, the chapel carries a peculiar stillness, as if holding its breath. Some say it's only the weight of centuries. Others whisper that beneath the floor the priest who tested death still listens for an answer that never came. Why would a man of faith choose the earth over air, burial over breath? Perhaps Father Wiktor Kulesza was not seeking death at all, but proof. Proof that silence itself could reveal God, that surrender could bridge the gap between the living and the divine. But faith, like the soil he trusted, can both cradle and consume. In his final act, Kulesza embodied the question humanity has carried for centuries. How far can devotion bend before it breaks? His descent was not rebellion nor purely belief. It was the fragile point where hope meets obsession, where prayer becomes an echo of itself. History, uncomfortable with extremes, buried his story for nearly a century. Yet even now his name stirs unease, not because of what he did, but because of what it asks of us. Would we have the courage to face silence that deep? Or would we mistake it, as he perhaps did, for the voice of God? And so the story ends where his began, in quiet. Maybe Father Kulesza wasn't trying to die. Maybe he wanted to listen long enough to hear if anything answered back.